Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the final part of Eastern Front Week number 3. It has flown past, although I have been doing 2 shows a day for 3 days. So I'm a bit ragged now, but it's been an amazing experience, amazing week. Nigel Askey's 3 shows about statistics were just phenomenal. Prit Buttar, of course, took us through the battles of the salient on Monday. That was great. But today, for the first time in 540 odd shows on World War II TV, we are tackling the Russian civilian experience. It's sort of come up in passing, but we've not dedicated a show to it. Well, today is the day. We're curing it now. My guest, Wendy Goldman, is a social and political historian, and she co-authored a book, Fortress Dark and Stern, that came out last year about the civilian experience. And one quote I read today about it, a review, is it doesn't just fill a gap, but it fills a gaping hole in our understanding of the Soviet civilian experience. So that's a pretty good little soundbite there. So, folks, if you are new to World War II TV, please don't forget to subscribe so you know what's coming up. Click the little bell so you get the notifications, and all the links you need are in the description. Whoops, I pressed the wrong button there. So, folks, if you need the information, it's all in the description below. The links to my guest's website, the book links. You can buy copies of the book from the bookstore link below, or you can buy it from your favorite bookshop or get it from your local library. But I'm going to bring in my guest, Wendy. So, good afternoon, Wendy. How are you today?
I'm fine.
So, before we get into the Russian civilian experience, I have to ask you, how did you personally get interested in the Eastern Front? Did it start very early in your career? Was it a later move? Tell us a bit about where your interest came from.
Well, over the course of my career, I have written many books on the Soviet Union. And I first visited the Soviet Union in 1984. And at that point, it was very difficult to ignore the war and the impact that it had on the people. The war in 1984 actually was still everywhere. It was in the seats on the metro that were reserved for war veterans. You could still see the pain of the war and the difficulties in the faces of older people, and every family had a story to tell about the war. And so I had always thought, I've written books on women and on the revolution and on the terror and Stalinism, but I always thought that I wanted to take up the war as a subject.
Well, and we're glad that you did, because it is, I think, the civilian aspect is the overlooked one in terms of Western literature. I mean, there's some sort of seminal Russian language versions, and of course we get into poetry and things like that about the kind of mythology of the Russian Soviet spirit that all ties in with Stalinism and things like that. But I think in the West, we tend to focus on the military campaigns and Barbarossa and Stalingrad and the battles for the factories. And I think what the Russian civilians achieved is really important and often overlooked. So you've come with a PowerPoint. We're not going to overload you with thousands of images. It's not like Nigel's shows of this morning where it was just data. It was amazing. But it is important stuff. So what we're going to do, the way we're going to hand it today, folks, is kind of Wendy's going to talk for kind of 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and do a little presentation, and then we'll do questions afterwards today. So we'll talk about the greater kind of influence of the civilians and how the civilian contribution helped with the war. But we'll kind of let Wendy talk, and thanks for everybody for being and watching it. 7 shows in 5 days is, I think, a World War II TV record. So if you're still at the end of it, watching them live, I'm really grateful for you to be here, and those who find it later, thank you as well. So Wendy, over to you. And there's the book cover there, folks, so you can go and find it in your local bookshop.
Well, thank you, Paul, for the opportunity to share some of our findings from Fortress Dark and Stern. For those of you who are interested, the book covers many topics in addition to evacuation, which is the subject that I'm going to be talking about today. It talks about the rationing system, about living conditions, starvation in the rear, labor mobilization, propaganda, and the liberation of the occupied territories. It's actually the first full overview of the Soviet home front in English based on Russian archival sources.
Wow.
So I think people will find a lot that is new to them in the book. Now, one of the things that I've seen in years of teaching and of lecturing is that actually very few people in the West know very much about the role of the Soviet Union in World War II. And even fewer know about what happened on the Soviet home front. I think most of this history has been hidden from ordinary people because of the Cold War. People with a strong interest in the war, and of course military experts, have a far better sense of the Soviet military role and the cost of the war to the country. We know that, for example, 26 to 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war, that large swaths of the country were occupied, that about 1/3 of the Jews who died in the Holocaust were murdered by the Nazis or their allies on Soviet soil. We also know that the overwhelming number of German divisions were concentrated on the Eastern Front, and that it was here, on the Eastern Front, that the Red Army broke the back of the Wehrmacht. We have a large body of military literature that's focused on the great battles. Yet there's been very little scholarship in English about the home front. Since the Soviet archives opened in the 1990s, a huge amount of new material has become available. And in addition, there are also now far more oral histories and memoirs. Almost every town in Russia has a website that's devoted to what they call the Great Patriotic War, and testimonies from ordinary people and from veterans. Today, I want to talk about one of the greatest feats of the war, and one that is not very well known in the West. This was the feat, actually, that made the victory of the Red Army possible. So I'm going to talk here today about a connection between the home front and the military front. Arguably, given the role of the Red Army in the war, we could say that this was the feat that won the war. And that feat was the evacuation of Soviet industry, people, grain, and herds from the territory that was occupied by the Nazis in the course of 1941 to 1942. So first, I want to make a few big points, providing an overview for you about evacuation. And Paul, I see you've already got our second slide up, so let's keep this up now. This is a frontline map, and it shows the retreat of the Red Army, beginning with the invasion on June 22nd, 1941, and it takes us up to December of 1941. And you can see the results of the Blitzkrieg in the first 2 weeks of the war. A good portion of Belarusia, Latvia, and Lithuania were occupied very rapidly. By September 1st, so in other words, by the end of that first summer, the Germans had advanced to the right bank of the Dnieper River, and by September 9th, Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, which are two major iron and steel producing cities that were critical to defense, were occupied as well. Most of the country's industry, its mines, its steel plants, its food factories, its electrical power plants, were concentrated in the western part of the Soviet Union. The territory that the Germans occupied between June 1941 and the fall of 1942 contained 40% of the Soviet Union's pre-war population and almost 32,000 industrial enterprises. Now, within 2 days of the invasion, so this was very, very quick, the government created a new body. That body was called the Soviet for Evacuation, and it was given the responsibility of rescuing machinery, people, grain, cultural treasures, and institutions that were in the path of the invaders. Evacuation lasted a little over a year, and it occurred in two phases. The first phase ran from June, the invasion, to December of 1941, and it reached its height in terms of the amount of material and people that were moving out between July and November. Then a second smaller phase lasting through the summer and fall of 1942, as the Red Army lost more territory in the south and retreated back toward the Volga. After the victory at Stalingrad in early 1943, evacuation was no longer necessary. And actually, the opposite process, namely the return, slowly began after Stalingrad. Slide 3. This frontline map here shows the additional territory lost up through May 1942 and the areas that were affected by the second, smaller evacuation. Most of the Donbass area was lost, including the great mining sector that was centered in the Donbass. Most of the mining equipment, however, was rescued. The remainder, whatever was left, was blown up. The mines were blown, they were flooded, or they were blocked with blown up machinery. And the Germans, who actually had hoped to exploit the very rich resources of the region, were unable to use them. By December 1941, so that's roughly within the first 6 months of the war, up to 17 million people and 2,600 industrial enterprises were evacuated from the territory that was soon to be occupied by the Nazis. This encompassed about 22% of the population and about 37% of the pre-war value of the industrial enterprises. The evacuation of the industrial base was an audacious feat. It was unprecedented in the history of warfare. It required great organizational coordination by the state and industry, and I would say also equally great courage by the industrial, railway, and construction workers who made it possible.
And just to interrupt for 1 second, Wendy, because I do like to interrupt every now and then, just for people who've been watching the previous shows, this is all happening concurrently with the massive mobilization of the Red Army to go the other direction. So if this was happening in isolation, it would be an amazing feat of arms. But it's happening at the same time as the country is mobilizing the greatest ever army in the shortest space of time ever in history. Nigel Askey made that point over the previous two shows, to go the other direction. So it's kind of like the Allies mounting Operation Overlord at the same time as mounting Operation Fortitude, but by comparison, those are minute, tiny operations compared to the enormity of this. And we have to remind ourselves, as we always do in terms of the Eastern Front, the distances are insane. I mean, you're from the USA, I'm from Britain, but so my country's smaller than yours. But when you get to this area here, the distances are just incredible. So I think it's just worth just taking our breath and realizing two incredibly huge operations taking place at the same time from a country that has barely kind of industrialized itself in the previous, couple of decades. It's extraordinary. And I'll let you carry on.
Well, thank you actually for making that point, because I'm going to come back to it when I talk about some of the constraints on evacuation. It's a really important point, and we need to keep it in mind. Absolutely. So just coming back to this feat, okay, which I think Paul's pointed out for us, some of the magnitude of it. Never had any state succeeded in rescuing an entire industrial base and transporting and then reconstructing it thousands of miles away, alongside millions of people, tons of grain, food stocks, and even herds. Workers were dismantling and packing up the plants, often under severe bombing, which is another point I think we need to remember. They loaded the machinery, raw materials, finished and semi-finished products onto rail cars amid explosions, floods, and fires. They were working literally around the clock. They were sleeping in the shops among the machines. At the same time, railway workers, which is another relatively unsung group of people, had to improvise new methods constantly of loading machinery that often weighed hundreds of tons from platforms that were not really constructed to hold that degree of tonnage, or an absence of cranes to pick it up and to move it onto the boxcars. So the railway workers were constantly improvising and inventing new methods for loading, as well as new ways of moving trains along very overcrowded and bombed out railway lines. So that too, you must think about this all in the context of war. The coordination that was necessary to deliver boxcars to the factories at the same time, and this goes back to the point that you just made, Paul, that they were attempting to speed troops and armaments to the front and civilians to the rear, required an enormously complicated amount of communication and of planning. And we can see this effort come vividly to life in real time in the archival documents of the Soviet for evacuation. What's interesting about evacuation is that it was made necessary by military defeat and territorial loss. But at the same time, it ultimately enabled the Soviet Union to continue to produce armaments beyond the range of enemy bombers and ultimately to win the war. So this is a kind of interesting dialectic if we take a look at this feat in relationship to the front. It was a great feat, but it's a curious one. It was dependent on the movement of the front, and its accomplishment was shaped entirely by defeat and retreat. Had there been no retreat, clearly evacuation would never have been necessary to the degree that it was. Now, the state faced a lot of challenges in evacuation. So evacuation plans, they not only targeted industry, but they also included the rescue of children, families, psychiatric patients, the staffs of scholarly and cultural institutions, hospitals, schools with young children, state organizations, as well as raw materials, sugar beet seedlings, grain, and herds. People were targeted for evacuation by their workplaces or schools. They were not targeted as individuals. So it wasn't something that you just ran to the railway station and bought a ticket, and whoever had the most money could buy possibly a ticket like for a concert. It didn't work that way. So people were evacuated in convoys or in groups. Once people were moved out of the threatened zones, they then had to be resettled in the rear. So they needed work, they needed housing, they needed food. Many of them needed medical care. And the evacuated population, unlike soldiers, was a very vulnerable group. It included old people, it included sick people, it included starving people from Leningrad, and it included invalids and a very large number of children. So here too, we immediately have a set of challenges, again, unprecedented, I think. The evacuations were also accomplished under severe constraints of transport and labor. And this is something that you just pointed out, Paul. So
just one more question again. I'm sorry to interrupt your flow. Had there been any kind of pre-war thought amongst the Soviet, high command or government that they might need to kind of do this? I mean, I'm thinking about Britain and the Dowding plan about air defense, or was it all simply constructed post the event, the opening shots of Operation Barbarossa?
That's a really good question. And it's actually one of the big questions that Don Filzer and I dealt with. And I'm going to address it in a short
Super.
time. Yeah. So these constraints, one was the military. The military urgently needed the rail lines and the boxcars so that we have one group moving west, one group trying to move east. And in addition, thousands of workers had already left the factories for the front. So we also have a shortage of labor going on as well within the factories. Moreover, and this was another really serious issue, state and economic officials understood at the time that evacuation was going to create a sharp, albeit temporary, drop in the production of desperately needed armaments. So there are memoirs, for example, of soldiers that describe being called up for training, and they were not training with guns, real guns. They were training with wooden implements. This drop in the production of armaments was really serious, and it had its effect on the Army. We all know that machines in boxcars cannot produce. So just at the moment, actually, that the armaments were most desperately needed at the front, evacuation also begins to ramp up, and we have this drop in production. As a result, there were all kinds of ways of sort of trying to maintain the level of production. Often plants would continue to operate until the very last possible moment, which made the decision about when to begin dismantling fraught with the danger of imminent occupation. And you can see that too emerging in the archives in terms of the telegrams and the records and all of that. You see this sense of local factory directors and party officials having to make decisions and not quite sure what's the point at which we need to just pack up now everything, stop production, and get out. I would say that many plants continued to produce until the last possible moment. And throughout the summer of 1941, there was panic, there was confusion reigning in the face of the invasion, and the Soviet for evacuation actually had very little time to master the challenges that it faced. So how was this feat accomplished? Let me just back up and talk a little bit about this now. I think the first thing is that the Soviet for evacuation was created immediately in the wake of the invasion.
Right.
So there is no dithering at all here on the home front. Within 2 days, on June 24th, 1941, the Central Committee and the Soviet of People's Commissars, that's the government, issued a very brief, strictly secret decree, which we now also can see in the archives, creating the Soviet for evacuation to, quote, to direct the evacuation of the population, institutions, military and other loads, the equipment of enterprises, and other valuables, end quote. 8 state and party leaders were selected to lead the SE, the Soviet for evacuation. These leaders also headed key state organizations that would be involved in evacuation, including heads of the railways, the head of the unions, the army, and industrial commissariats. Its first head, Lazar Kaganovich, called the SE's first meeting the very day it was created. Now, initially, no decision was made to evacuate the industrial base and resettle it in the east. The group did not expect much territory to be lost. So it had a limited view of its charge, which was namely the evacuation of people and property from the threatened frontline zones. So it saw its task in a fairly limited way. It's also interesting that the SE had no apparatus of its own. It relied on the existing pyramid of Soviets that were based in the localities, in other words, local government, the Commissariat of Railways, and the industrial commissariats, the Commissariat of Steel, of Coal, of electric power plants, to carry out the task. So the SC, in a way, when we think about it, it sort of embodies a set of paradoxes as an organization. It is highly centralized, but at the same time, it depends on this vast local base of Soviets, of local government, to implement its decisions. It's an organization that is newly created by the war, and yet it relies heavily on the existing state structures. And finally, it's composed of very powerful party leaders, but it gave its local staff considerable leeway to resolve crises. And these paradoxes, and I can talk a little bit more about the role of the plenipotentiaries, in other words, the local people that were given power, empowered to resolve issues. These paradoxes, I think, are largely responsible for its success. Now, up to the invasion, the state promulgated the idea, and this was true both within the military and the civilian sectors, that if war began, it would be fought beyond the pre-1939 borders. In other words, on the territory that before the Hitler-Stalin Pact, not on Soviet soil. And this message was repeated a lot within movies and the news and in all kinds of ways. So to some extent, the invasion came as a shock. On June 22nd, 1941, the Blitzkrieg, with all of its key elements, and it had already overrun most of Europe, east and west, its heavy bombing, rapid tank advance, then followed by infantry, overran the border. And the Red Army fell back in disordered retreat. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner very, very quickly. Slide 4.
And just one more question again. If I'm annoying with my questions, do tell me to stop asking them. But the fact that this order was given the very day of the invasion, is it because also it's a psychological thing to make, by starting it yourself, it's then the Soviet decision to do that rather than reacting to doing it? If you leave it a couple of weeks after the Germans have started pushing, then you're reacting to what the Germans are doing, what the enemy are doing, like you're being forced to do it. Whereas if you do it yourself, it's making it, oh, we always wanted to do this. It's our thing. It's our policy. This is part of our war plan. Does that make any sense?
You're talking about the creation of the Soviet for evacuation. Yeah. There were pre-war plans for evacuation. I think one of the things that's interesting is that, you know, from I think the military stuff that you've read, that there is a whole critique of Stalin's leadership and his lack of preparedness. And one of the findings of Fortress Dark and Stern is that I think that critique can be justified on the military front. But what's interesting is that on the home front, we don't see that. We actually see them move into action very quickly. And I'm going to come back to that point when I talk about preparedness, because that is one of the interesting larger questions here, I think. So, okay, we have the Blitzkrieg, we have the invasion. And we also know that at this point, Hitler's Barbarossa orders go into effect. And these orders were actually orders to the army concerning the mass murder of Jews, partisans, resistors, Soviet officials, and party members. Mass shooting of the civilian population began immediately by the Einsatzgruppen who were following the army. So this mass killing, what makes the Eastern Front actually so different from what happens in France or in other places, this mass murder of civilians begins very, very rapidly. And as a result of this treatment, we have panic, we have confusion, we have all kinds of panic amongst the civilian population, raining all along. We are talking about over 1,000-mile front. Local officials along the border in the frontline zones did not know how to respond. And now I'm not talking about the army officers. I'm talking about local Soviet officials, in other words, local government. The Red Army was retreating so fast and in such disarray that often local officials in the towns and villages in the frontline zones had no information about where the front was even located. Moscow had no good information about where the front was located. In other words, they could not tell people in the localities what was going on. And as a result, local Soviet officials and party activists didn't know whether to instruct the local population to stay or to flee, or whether to evacuate, to abandon, or to blow up valuable property. So that first sense, I think, is important for us to think about. There is just panic going on. On June 27th and the 29th, so this is within a week now of the invasion, and then again, here again, we're seeing rapid response. The Central Committee and the Soviet of People's Commissars issued 2 decrees, which were aimed at quelling panic and providing direction. The first decree was sent secretly to members of the Soviet for evacuation, as well as Soviet and Republic officials, and it laid out a strategy of scorched earth as part of the plan for evacuation. And what it said was the following: all valuable property, raw materials, and food stocks, and wheat in the field, so that's wheat that's still growing, which cannot be shipped out and is left in place, can be used by the enemy. Following the instructions of the military Soviets at the front, that's the officers, it should all be quickly ruined, destroyed, or burned. So that was the policy of scorched earth. The second decree, which was issued 2 days later and dispatched now to all party and Soviet organizations in the frontline zones, urged people, quote, to fight to the last drop of blood, to show courage, initiative, and daring. The instructions were unequivocal. Quote, drive off the railroad rolling stock. Do not leave the enemy a single locomotive, a single boxcar. Do not leave the enemy a kilogram of bread, not a liter of gasoline. Kolkhozniki, collective farmers, scatter the cattle, deliver grain to the state for shipment to the rear. All valuable property, including metal, grain, and gasoline, which cannot be shipped out, should be unconditionally destroyed. So nothing of value was to be left for the Germans. Now, these decrees placed a great deal of responsibility on local officials, who were forced to make rapid and difficult decisions, often in the absence of reliable military information. At what point do you blow up the tractors and the combines? At what point do you scatter the cattle? At what point do you blow a plant when you don't know where the front is? So this too is something we need to think about. You know, when we think about people making decisions in real time, we need to have some sense of what the larger context was. The policy of scorched earth also, if you just think about it for even a minute, has deep implications for the local population. If no agricultural or farm animals remain, no agricultural produce or animals, what happens to the people who are not evacuated? Scorched earth implies that the population will not remain. And yet, when we think about everything that was going on with evacuation, many of these areas were rural, and there were very few provisions made for evacuating people in small villages and towns that were located far from railroad stations. And many of these people, and Jews in particular, would remain behind, and they would die at the hands of the Germans. The area that was occupied is pocked with shooting pits, and we're looking at one of them right here, in which millions of people were murdered. So that too is a whole other issue that we need to think about when we're keeping all of this in context. Slide 5. The SE's very first efforts, so this is right in the beginning, we can see now people here in a rural area attempting to move out, were direct responses to the threat of bombing or occupation. And women and children quickly became one of its primary targets. So, working under great pressure created by the unfolding disaster at the front, the SE began shipping out people and material under what was called rapid evacuation. That was an official phrase that denoted no set destination, but rather the need simply to rescue and move out. The front, meanwhile, was moving so rapidly that many industrial commissariats took the initiative in pressing the SE to evacuate their factories. So in Moscow, if we switch now from the frontline zones to what's happening in the center of government, the SE's telephones were ringing endlessly with frantic calls from the commissariats about shipments of metal, machinery, and raw material. Slide 6. In the summer, the SE began evacuating the agricultural base. Government leaders understood that if all the grain, sugar beets, and herds were lost, the country was going to starve. And this actually was part of the Nazi hunger plan, which had been devised earlier by Herbert Baca. They expected a large section of the occupied territories to simply starve to death. So sugar beets and grain from frontline areas under attack received priority over all other loads in this initial period. And in July, the SE began evacuating equipment and herds from the collective farms. This was the least successful of the evacuation efforts. There were huge challenges in moving herds across war-torn country, amid bombing and across rivers. Feeding and watering the animals en route, providing veterinarian services were all very, very challenging. But in fact, huge convoys were created throughout Ukraine and Russia. Crossings were built across the Dnieper River, for example. Flotillas of every possible conveyance, if it floats, it's employed, were organized by party activists. The Germans bombed the crossings. There were massive stampedes, dead animals, and people everywhere floating in the rivers. But the exodus continued. It continued by day and by the light of the moon. And by October, about 3 million pigs, cows, sheep, and horses had successfully crossed the Dnieper. Another huge crossing would later occur at the Volga on the banks of Stalingrad. In mid-August, the SE began shipping out the newly harvested grain. Next slide. In August, as the Germans took more territory, the SE began focusing on shipping out the industrial base of Ukraine along the right bank of the Dnieper River. Workers in Dnipropetrovsk began dismantling the great steel plants. Germans bombed the railroad platform, which was jammed with crowds of people waiting to evacuate. There were hundreds of deaths, people scattered, screaming in every direction. But between August 8th and the 22nd, workers in Dnipropetrovsk had shipped out 10,000 boxcars and more than 200,000 people by rail. This feat was repeated throughout Belarusia, Ukraine, and Russia as the Germans conquered more and more territory. In Zaporozhye, as the battle raged for Kiev, the workers dismantled the massive iron and steel plants on both sides of the river. Zaporozhye straddled the Dnieper River. As the Red Army retreated, it blew the hydroelectric dam and the great three-arched bridge which spanned the Dnieper, causing a massive flood through Zaporozhye. The party organized workers from all over the Donbass to rush to the left bank of Zaporozhye to help with the loading, as the Germans were shelling the plants from the newly captured right bank. By early October, the Red Army was forced to retreat from the left bank as well, but the loading and the shipping was done. And actually, the workers joked that the only thing that was left for them to do was to sweep out the empty machine shops, and they decided to leave that task for the Germans. The metallurgical plants had been saved. The evacuation of Zaporozhye was connected to the battle for Kiev. So Kiev, as we know, was occupied on September 19th, and it resulted in the encirclement of 665,000 Red Army soldiers. That's one of the largest encirclements in war ever. Khrushchev later bitterly criticized Stalin for not ordering a more timely retreat. In other words, for seeking to hold the Kiev salient. And here's one of the ways that the home front and the military front are closely intertwined. Although Khrushchev was very, very critical of the decision to hold on to Kiev, other military experts contend that by drawing off German troops in the Battle of Kiev from the Central Front and also drawing them off from Zaporozhye, it enabled the Red Army to hold Moscow later in December, and also to allow the evacuation of Zaporozhye's iron and steel industry. So again, in a lot of these military debates, I think it's really important to take into account not just a single battle, but an entire front, and also to evaluate decisions in light of home front policies as well. Now, the workers who accompanied the evacuated convoys traveled months and thousands of miles east, where they reassembled the factories. And in many cases, they began actually setting up the machinery under open skies as soon as they arrived. They were literally running the machines as the walls of a new factory rose up around them. During the summer and fall of 1941, an efficient system for planned evacuation emerged. The SE's efforts involved local officials in a massive centralized effort, and I would say panic was steadily conquered by plan. The SE's work involved mastery not only of the immediate needs of a single factory or a locality, but of the entire front, as well as the national economy and the railway system. So all of those things were critical. If, for example, you're blowing up mines, there have to be new sources of coal that are created in the east, new mines opened and exploited that can then fuel the defense factories that are being evacuated. So the entire integrated economy needs to be reconfigured. And that too is something we need to take into account. The SE was responsible for coordinating the dismantling of massive industrial complexes, assigning them the proper number of boxcars, tracking them en route, and approving their destinations for reconstruction. By mid-July of 1941, so this is quick, it had established a system of accounting and enumeration that enabled it to track every convoy and boxcar. It tracked hundreds of thousands of boxcars in various stages of loading, traveling, and arrival. It received updated and detailed information from the commissariats and the railroad stations about departures and arrivals. At any given moment, it could pinpoint the precise location of each convoy en route, the stations it had passed, those it would pass, and its final destination. By mid-August, so this is still now within just a few months of the invasion, the government had reconfigured the country's 5-year plan. This is the economic plan for the entire country, to include the shift of industry from west to east. And it had created a new master plan, wartime plan for production based on the newly constructed industry in the east. Now, the chain of command from the SE to the industrial commissars, to the individual factory directors, to the workers on the shop floor required tremendous support and effort from the people who translated these orders into action. And it got that support by and large from Soviet workers. So this is the group. This feat rested on the shoulders of this group. This is the group that translated these orders into action. And here you can see a woman railway worker who is directing railway traffic along the lines, but there were millions of these people actually that made this possible. I also just want to mention a few of the objective constraints on the SE's ability to evacuate. We know, for example, not all of industry was rescued, and a large portion of the population did not succeed in either fleeing or being officially evacuated. So what was the problem? Why not more? Well, the main constraint on the SE was the lack of boxcars. Even the aviation and ammunition factories, which were given the highest priority, showed a considerable gap between the number of boxcars they needed and the number they received. And this gap emerges in all of the documents in the archives. So you can see people frantically telegramming the SE, telegramming the industrial commissariats telegraphing party leaders, please send more boxcars. We're all packed up. We're ready to go. Please send more boxcars. Many factories and regions received barely half the boxcars they requested to carry out a full evacuation. This was not because the government did not want to send them. It was because, as Paul pointed out in the beginning of our show, boxcars were also needed by the military. They were speeding troops to the front. They were needed for armaments. They were needed for many, many things. There were simply not enough. A second constraint was the amount of traffic any one railway line could bear within a given period. Now, those of us who are not railroad buffs don't really know much about this. You just think, oh, let's just run more trains. But anyone that's ever been stuck in gridlock in traffic in a car understands that a road actually can only take a certain number of cars before slow down, stoppages, delays, and even gridlock can result. Actually, this is a mathematical number. In other words, for every line, it can be mathematically worked out how many boxcars can be accommodated, how many trains, how many convoys can be accommodated along the line. And this is worked out by railway specialists. So this is part of the railroad system. It had to be worked out in accordance with troop movements, with food deliveries, and other essential traffic of just a functioning integrated economy. So all of those things had to be taken into effect. And the traffic limits also placed serious constraints on shipping and loading. Now, I want to come back to a question that Paul's actually asked twice, and is a very important one. And that has to do with the question of planning and preparedness. So we know that many historians blame Stalin for a lack of military preparedness. And this is actually true among Russian historians and Western historians. They argue that the defeats of the first 18 months might have been avoided with better planning. One of the findings, though, of Fortress Dark and Stern was that the organization of the home front, unlike that of the military front, was actually very effective. This was true not only of evacuation, but it was also true of the ration system and of labor mobilization. And these were the three pillars of the home front wartime system. Now, that's not to say there weren't screw-ups and there wasn't chaos and there wasn't confusion and there were not massive problems and issues. There were. But it is to say that on the whole, I think the planning on the home front in all of these very, very important areas was extremely effective and was critical to understanding the victory of the Soviet Union in World War II. The SE's main challenge was not how to evacuate a single factory or a town. That was a task actually mastered pretty quickly, how to get it done in one place. The problem, the main issue, was the organization and coordination of evacuation along a very broad front, over 1,000-mile front, that was moving with frightening rapidity. Now, without advanced knowledge of the front line or the ability to predict its movement, the creation of truly useful pre-war plans involved far too many unknown variables. So that's something to consider when we think about, let's say, if perhaps there had been more pre-war planning and evacuation, it would have been more successful. I'm not sure that was the case. The audacious feat of evacuation was the result not only of the decree that established the SE, that was the foundational decree, but it's an evolving system. We're looking at planning in action that's undertaken by the SE in a kind of dynamic coordination with workers, party activists, Soviet officials, factory directors, and industrial commissars. The extensive experience of workers and planners with the great industrialization drive of the 1930s made the feat of evacuation possible. The planned industrialization of the 1930s gave the country's leaders and its people the confidence and the experience to think big, to surmount confusion and panic, and to recreate the industrial base in the East. Workers understood, we built this thing in the 1930s. We built it in a decade. We know how to take it apart, and we know how to put it back together again. So I think this experience with industrialization, with planned industrialization, planned socialist industrialization, was something that really stood the country in good stead. Next slide. Of course, the evacuation of the industrial base to the sparsely populated East carried huge consequences. The government would now have to recruit a labor force from afar. This proved to be another great feat of the war and a major element of the wartime experience for millions of people. But that's the story for another day. Thank you.
Well, I mean, spellbinding. Thank you very much. I mean, just amazing. It connects with so many things we've done in the past. It connects with other shows we've done this week. Brilliant. If you're okay, we'll do a few questions. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
So Woody Lee asked a few minutes ago, did the rapid relocation of the factories have an impact on the logistical supply network that brought the raw materials to the factories?
Absolutely. In terms, a whole new infrastructure had to be reconstructed in the East. So, for example, railway spur lines to newly constructed factories had to be set up. Evacuated factories were often situated in the same buildings, existing buildings, as already existing factories in other places. All of that had to be combined: workforces, machinery, leadership, toxic emissions now of two different kinds of factories that were often side by side in the same building. I mean, all of this had to be resolved. Mining in the Kuzbas had to be increased enormously because the Donbass mines were lost. So I would say in every way that you can think of, yes, it had an enormous effect on infrastructure.
Okay, and another regular viewer, the Great Dominion, is asking kind of a ponderous question. I mean, how far east was far enough? How far east was too far? How did they figure out where to stop it? But it is a good question. It's a valid question.
It's a very good question. Often they didn't know. So I tell you just a tragic example. Many children from Leningrad were in a summer camp in the areas slightly to the west. With the invasion, they began trying to get the kids out of camp and to speed them back to the city. And then the city was surrounded. And they tried to get people out of the city, often to areas that were just a little bit further to the east. And then those areas were overtaken. There were a number of factories that had to be moved a number of times, and same with people. So the centers for production, where a lot of the factories were moved to, was in the Urals. So to Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and other cities that had actually begun to develop their own iron and steel industries, Magnitogorsk, for example, in the 1930s. That was well beyond the reach of German bombers. But that was a question, it was an unknown. How far do we need to go? And, you know, Stalin makes this famous speech when the Red Army has finally retreated. It has its back to the Volga, and we're about to have the great Battle of Stalingrad. He says to the country, there is no further place to retreat. We have to make the stand now. So that issue of where and how far, I think, was one that was constantly being considered and
being debated. Yeah. So more about the research this time. Stephen is asking, he's curious about the logistics behind the translation of the research documentation for your project.
I'm not exactly sure. So,
I mean, you know, just the process of how you got to these documents and the translation of them and the culling of information.
Okay. Well, Don Filzer and I did about 10 years worth of research in Moscow in the archives. And we worked in 4 or 5 different archives, primarily, I would say, within the State Archive and also within the Communist Party Archive, both of which had enormous holdings. All of the SE's records are in the State Archive. There are more folders than any one person could possibly look at in a lifetime. So that proved to be an enormous source. There were also similar sources, for example, in the union holdings, in the rationing, the Commissariat of Trade, which was reconverted to rationing, had a huge amount of holdings. So the Russian archives proved, I would say, just indispensable. And then we had some wonderful sources. There's an archive now called Centropa, which did interviews with people, primarily it's a Jewish population who survived the war, and experienced evacuation or lived under survived occupation. They did extensive interviews with people, and people described their experience both as Red Army soldiers in evacuation, working in factories, all of that. That was a wonderful source for like firsthand accounts. And as I said, there are wonderful sources, that have been collected in Russian, both secondary and primary sources that we used as well.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And my next question kind of is my one this time, and it's more about the whether or not enough work has been done to connect this civilian story with the military history, because so much work is done on, you've talked about it yourself, the whether people see it as the failings of the Red Army in 1941 or the success of the Red Army in 1941, Stalin's preparedness or unpreparedness. But from my point of view, I don't think maybe enough has been done to connect these two stories. And I'm thinking about Adam Tooze's amazing work on the German economy, and I think the understanding of the Soviet economy, it's a bit horse and cart, isn't it? There's no point getting an army ready if you've got no factories to make munitions for the army. You've got to start with something first, and it's now making sense to me that in that desperate time in 41, you've got limited resources. As you said, they're limited wagons, rails. What's the priority? Now, an invasion coming over your border seems the obvious priority, but actually maybe the establishment of this infrastructure behind is the long-term better strategy. So that's where my kind of thinking is going there. And we had a question earlier I'm going to ask you, which I've got to scroll back and find it now, from World War II analyzed. What role did compulsion versus patriotism ideology, and I'm going to add desperation in there as well, play in this stupendous national effort? Because you talked about the panic involving there. So when people are doing all this mobilization, are they doing it because they have to? Are they doing it because they want to? Are they doing it for the country? What's your feeling on that? Or is it too broad, too complicated when you're considering millions of people?
I think that's a great question, and we actually considered it closely in one of the chapters on propaganda and loyalty. So obviously, you're talking about a country with millions of people, and people had a whole variety of motivations. And there was also draconian labor legislation as well. So people could be sentenced to prison for leaving a job voluntarily. The entire country was placed under military discipline. And although many, many people did leave and often went to work somewhere else, at the same time, there was this very, very strict labor legislation. So we have to take that into account as well. I would say, though, on the whole, I think that there was enormous support for the war effort. Now, that doesn't mean everybody, obviously. We also know there was a lot of collaboration in the occupied territories, although that's a slightly different question. And, people have explored that too, collaboration under duress, collaboration out of hatred for the Soviet system. I mean, a whole variety of motivations. Okay. On the home front, I would say if we're just looking at motivations, every single family had someone at the front. So that in of itself made, let's say, the motivation to work longer, harder, better, very, very powerful. There were frontline maps posted in all of the factories. So when people came to work, they pored over the frontline maps every day. Looking at the little pin marks and where they had moved and all of that. People had a great deal of knowledge of what was going on. So I have looked at stenographic reports in the party archive of meetings that party activists would hold, for example, in the factories or the collective farms or with local people. And people asked very sophisticated questions about the front. They wanted to know, for example, there was a period in Rzhev where the front simply couldn't advance at all. It was called the Rzhev meat grinder. They asked questions about that. They followed the front closely. So I think there was this just personal sense of profound involvement in the war. Second, I think that anti-fascism really meant something to people, and I don't think we should discount that. It was seen as a just war. It was seen as a good cause. It was seen as something that the country really could get behind for all kinds of moral and ethical reasons. And there had been an enormous amount of news through the 30s about all of that. The Civil War in Spain. Some people later wrote, Spain was a full education for me. So people had an understanding of fascism and what it meant. When the Red Army began retaking territory, the first territory that was actually retaken in December of 1941 around Moscow, when they pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow, what they discovered was a shock. And the degree to which the civilian population had been brutalized. Every little town had a gallows that were set up. Women had their breasts cut off. Men were hanging. People had been slaughtered. I mean, there were these pits, shooting pits all over. This really began to take off, I think, in terms of reportage after Stalingrad, after the Red Army began now marching back west. And what they discovered was simply unprecedented in terms of the level of atrocity. Nobody really knew about the Holocaust at that point. And that then began to be reported in the newspapers. And I think that too created this sense, okay, we've been told about fascism. We know abstractly about fascism and its racial hatreds, but here is fascism. Yeah. This is what it looks like.
In your village, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
And you could see it. So that was something. And I will say one last thing about this too. We found a lot of testimony from workers within the party archive. You know, the revolution was not too far past. And when you think about it, it was, only 20 years behind. And in the Red Army and in the factories, we had people who had fought in the revolution, who had fought for the Reds. And there were people, many people, especially among workers, less so among peasants, but especially among workers, who saw themselves fighting to save socialism and to preserve the revolution. And that too comes out in the things that people say. So I think all of those things played a role in creating that kind of support.
Well, that was a great answer. It's reminding me of the show I did with Dr. Ian Garner about a year ago about Stalingrad in popular memory. And you have to kind of look at the various phases of the Soviet Union and the different experiences at different times. And we are now, as you said, you started off referencing the Cold War. We now know the dark period. I'm not saying the war wasn't dark as well, but the 50s and the KGB and things. And, you know, as you said, for some of these people, the revolution, the ideology, the dream world was just one generation behind. It was people who'd fought and died for it. So great response. I'll do a couple more questions. Norma over in Canada, another regular viewer. I'm curious as to how the evacuation affected Eastern USSR post-war. Did workers in the factories go back west or did they stay? That's a good question.
It's a great question. Many of the factories actually stayed and many also went back. So we have a combination of things. But the East was actually reconfigured. It was a kind of mini industrialization because all of that infrastructure that I think your first questioner had asked about, those spur railway lines, the newly dug mines, the water, sewerage, all that stuff, the increase in the size of the towns, many of those features actually remained. So I think we can say that it was both. And then, of course, almost as soon as territories were liberated, there were new drafts through mobilized labor to reopen those mines, to rebuild those plants, to get things working again. So we have that effort begins actually right after Stalingrad. We see the first workers that come to Stalingrad to rebuild the city. And we can find those orders in the Soviet for Evacuation and the Labor Mobilization Committee. When I saw that, coming to Stalingrad now to rebuild the city and to make it back, bring it back and reopen those plants again, it was a very moving document to see that.
No, definitely. Now, there was several people who are watching have read your book, so that's great. But one of the questions, the subject that came up earlier, I'm now going to put it into a question, is about some party officials who left too early. So Patty's asking, how many officials ran away and left their people behind them? What happened to those local officials if found miles away from there without a good excuse? And I'll add the other question that came earlier, is did that have an effect? If your local party official has gone away, does that leave panic? Basically, what did that experience have effect on the program?
There was a lot of panic. And initially, and this is recognized even in government documents. In other words, not just letters that people are writing in infuriated about what's happening, but they admitted that precious boxcars were often loaded with people's furniture, party official furniture, plants. I mean, nonsense, right? Cars were commandeered and people moved their families out. There is no question. There was a great deal of panic. And there were people that tried to basically save their families and abandon their posts. Or ship their families out, and to the detriment of all the other people around them. So, it's human behavior. You saw the entire range. There was also chaos. And so I think a lot of local officials who may have fled and left people were not necessarily punished. They were put to work quickly doing something else. It was also very difficult. It's not like things were functioning in an orderly manner. So it was very hard to even track what was going on. People were supposed to stay in place until they were told to leave. But as I mentioned in the beginning, nobody knew where the front was. And so frequently orders didn't come in time. So in that kind of a case, you have people fleeing. Was that the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do? And who, in fact, was sitting around doing nothing, just waiting to evaluate it? So I think a lot of this just got lost in the chaos.
Okay, well, that's a great response. I think we'll make this the last question, although we may do some summit. Another regular viewer, Gary, is asking, and I'm going to word it maybe slightly differently. Can you comment on how the issue of the Second Front played out inside the Soviet Union? Perhaps the changing course of the war may have affected that. Now, that question came up before you mentioned the fact that they're already starting to rebuild factories in after Stalingrad. So the Second Front, by the summer of 44, maybe things have already made their changes in the Soviet Union. But I'll answer the question anyway. Did the opening up of the Second Front and what the Western allies are doing have any impact on this basic policy of the factories and relocations and any decision making back in the Soviet Union?
The Soviet people and the government were desperate for the Second Front. And we know, of course, there were differences between Roosevelt and Churchill about opening the Second Front. Churchill was much more hesitant. And you can argue that he understood the costs of such a crossing better perhaps than Roosevelt did, or you can argue, and a lot of Soviet people did understand it this way, unfortunately, that the delay, what they considered to be a delay in the Second Front, we know the Second Front was not opened until June of 1944. I mean, at that point, from the Soviet perspective, the war was coming to an end. So the question was, why did it take so long? And I would say the popular thinking at the time was that the West was delaying on purpose to bleed out the Soviet Union so that the West could come in at the very end, clean up, and take over in all of its strength and glory. And there was a kind of, disappointment, fury, pain, despair. When will the second front be opened? And at every record, stenographic report I read of just about every meeting, people ask, they are begging, when will the second front be opened? And why are they taking so long? And, when Churchill said, I think to Stalin, that there were the dangers of the crossing, et cetera, and they wanted to be in a better position and all of this, Stalin replied, we're taking enormous losses. Like, you have to do this. Churchill cited losses, and Stalin said, what do you think is happening here? So, there was, I think, a lot of political despair about this, and the first mistrust of the West, which would become so powerful during the Cold War, actually on both sides, mistrust of the other. We see this around the issue of the second front.
Well, thank you for that. And I think my last question is really going to be, and another kind of a ponderous one, really, is the situation we're in now with the situation in Iraq, Ukraine, is that what is the future going to be for the study of the Eastern Front? I mean, you were talking about your first visit there in 1984, and had you been on this show perhaps before February, obviously the answer to that question will be different then than it is now. And we're not going to comment on the actual situation in Ukraine right now, but in terms of the long-term study, what as someone who spent a lifetime studying this country, what are the long-term implications about our understanding of the Soviet Union World War II with what's going on right now?
I think it's really, really going to hurt the field of Soviet studies enormously. The ability to work in the archives was a wonderful aspect of the opening up, I would say, of Soviet Union. Of course, it was also collapsing at the time, and it was very painful to go there and see what the collapse of socialism created among ordinary people. But the opening in terms of the archives was an enormous treasure for researchers to be able to do the kind of work that we did since the early 1990s. Now we can't go there, and Russians cannot come west. And all of the things that I would say, I dedicated a life to, as did so many people in our field, which was creating these kinds of exchanges, fighting against a Cold War mentality, fighting against NATO encroachment, and this idea that, the West needed to militarize more and more of Eastern Europe right up to Russia's border. All of these things and I was not alone in these struggles throughout, Britain. Certainly there were huge movements to anti-nuclear movements and other things to try to create more friendship among people and more exchanges among people. All of this has pretty much come to an end. It is my fervent hope that peace will be created between Ukraine and Russia.
Well, that is a great way to end it. Thank you very much for that. Although there is one kind of yes or no question for you, it's putting you into a corner a bit. But World War II analyzer saying, will you come back and discuss your book, Hunger and War? So...
Well, I'll leave that up to Paul, but let's just say I would be very happy to talk about the rationing system and about starvation on the home front and about feeding the people in the context of absolute scarcity. It's much worse than the boxcars.
I'll take that as a yes then, and you were very slick in that you were able to you mentioned the meat grinder in the presentation, which was the subject of Monday's show. So you tied all the themes together perfectly. It was like you wrapped everything up. The final part of the season, all the loose ends tied up. So a very professional job there. So So thank you very much. It was really good. I'm just going to take you off screen for a second while I do my promo. I'll bring you back in a second. So, folks, that's it. Me done for the weekend. I'm off for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Then next week, we're off to the Pacific again. Some naval and aviation actions there to explain. James M. Scott is on. John R. Brunning is on. Jeff Dacus. It's another action-packed show. Set of shows, and then there's Arnhem Week coming up, and it's all just very exciting. So just an extraordinary array of shows coming your way. I'm working ridiculous hours lining them all up for you, so please stick with us and share what we're doing on social media. But again, once to remind you, I think that Wendy Goldman's book is a must-have. If you want to understand the Eastern Front, go and get and understand this civilian experience. The links are in the description below. But I'll bring Wendy back in basically to say thank you and goodbye. So your first appearance, you knocked it out of the park. That was absolutely amazing. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. So brilliant. There we are. This is Paul Woodad from World War II TV. So I'll see you all again next week. Thank you very much for your attention this week. Cheers, everybody. Bye.